Welcome to class. Today we'll talk about language and variation. As we have been talking in this course in different lectures, every speaker or every user of a language has an idiolect or individual centric variety. So we all use a language in a different way, and the communication happens on a broader shared understanding about the structures and meaning associated with them. So we all have our own style of speaking. We all have our own, version and variety of language. Such a dynamic nature language has. So we are talking about language and variation today, and we all vary in our use of language, dialect, variety, code. There is a deliberate motive behind putting all these categories together. The idea of language, dialect, or variety or code, they are all the same. They are not different terms, but they have different connotations in which they are used. They have social connotations, and as a linguist or the person who is in linguistics, for them, they all belong to the same category. However, we have socio-cultural connotations in using one or the other term. So we all vary in terms of our pronunciation, for that matter, accent, for that matter, choice of words. We might express morphological differences, different syntactic structures, sentence structures. We all may vary in terms of style of speech. We may vary in terms of conversation style, right? So within the same speech community, within the same language boundary or the dialect boundary, we find these variations. While the diversity of variation is huge, there are certain restrictions on variation. So it's not indefinitely and infinitely variant. There are certain restrictions which apply, and there is certain common understanding because of which we are able to communicate. Such variations have patterns. They are not random variations, they have a pattern, and they are consistent in a particular speech community. Such linguistic variations can be attributed to differences in social characteristics of the speakers using that particular variety or language. And these variations have a number of socio-cultural factors which contribute, factors like age for that matter, right? Factors like gender for that matter, class for that matter, geographical location, socio-cultural space, context in which you use, right? Uh, the way you construct your identity, linguistic identity and linguistic allegiance for that matter, solidarity that you express with the other members of the community, speech community. So language variation is a very normal natural phenomena, and we all vary in terms of that. But certain variations which become point of study, certain variations which become focus of study, are related to these social factors, and they are consistent in nature, they are predictable, and this is what we study in social linguistics called language variation. The pioneer, the one who pioneered this study is William Lebov, and who very meticulously established a correlation between linguistic variables and social structures. And from there we see a variationist tradition of studying the language in society. Now, as I told you, I deliberately put dialect, language, code, variety all together in the same bracket because we do have, different kind of ideas about language, about dialect, right? The prestige that is assigned to a particular dialect, the prestige that is assigned, prestige value that is assigned to a particular language. Now we need to understand what is a language and what is a dialect, right? This debate is very old, and it's more of linguistic attitude that the speakers of a particular dialect or language assign to another dialect or variety. There is no linguistic basis of making distinction about language and dialect. It's more of a socio-cultural attribute that we assign. Uh, and there is no universally accepted criterion for distinguishing two different languages and two different dialects. In fact, the language that we speak is also a socially favored dialect. So, nobody speaks our language, we all speak a dialect, right? And what you call language is actually accidentally and deliberately socially favored, culturally favored dialect that acquires a high prestige value and that is codified, standardized, and it becomes a language, so called language. But actually, the variety that you speak, even if you, that this whole binary idea of a standard and vernacular is misnomer and confusing, right? Each variety has equal potential of becoming so called standard language. It is the social, institutional, cultural, institutional support to a particular variety, a favor to a particular variety, which makes it a language. So, we all speak dialect. Standard English is also a dialect of that imagined English. Nobody speaks that so called standard variety. This is just a political position, ideological position that we take. This distinction can be understood in terms of some a frame of references, how we look at a dialect. We will come to that shortly. But broadly, we understand dialect in terms of a regional, temporal, or social variety within a single speech community. It is the product of individuals' geographical space and class origin. It may differ in grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary from the standard, so called in quotes, a standard language, which is itself is a socially favored dialect, and it is a variation of language sufficiently different to be considered a separate entity, but not different enough to be called a separate language. However, there is no clear qualitative linguistic measures and quantitative linguistic measures to indicate whether differences of dialect become differences of language. This issue is purely political, social, and cultural. So, I was talking about frame of references, how you look at a particular dialect, that tells you, right, the whole story. So, we go by linguistic distance. So, the difference in structures, how a particular variety differs in terms of linguistic structures to the other particular variety. That distance tells if the differences are very high, there are two separate codes, varieties or language. If the differences are overlapping and very low, then we consider two varieties of the same language. Then mutual intelligibility is another frame of reference through which we see the dialectal variations, dialectal differences, and that is the speakers of dialect 1 and the speakers of dialect 2 are able to communicate, mix and share, and though both the varieties are mutually intelligible, they understand each other and communication is not interrupted, sharing is not interrupted, interaction is not interrupted, they can understand each other. So, the second frame of reference is mutual intelligibility, to what extent they are able to understand each other. That determines whether it is a variant of the same language or are the two separate languages. The third frame of reference in terms of understanding the difference between language and dialect is socio-political factor, right. So, it is the language attitude or the prestige value that the speakers of variety 1 assign to speakers of variety 2 or variety 2 for that matter. So, these are three references, frames of references that allow us to understand the difference between a dialect and a language. So, mutual intelligibility for that matter remains the major reference point. Now, another variation that we find is register. So, within the same language or within the same linguistic repertoire, we have variations in registers. So, if dialects are varieties according to the users, then registers are the varieties according to the use, according to the occupation and the context associated with the language users. So, it is context specific, it is occupation specific, and registers like religious registers. So, when you are talking about religion in a religious context, you find a set of terms and words and style of speaking different from, let us say, scientific registers. So, people in technology and science, the style of speaking, the conversation, degree of formality associated with it, legal registers, right, in the legal context, commercial, you might have seen airport railway announcements, telephone operators, the way they talk, call centers. So, these are different registers, different varieties. However, they are not different dialects or different languages within the same speech community based on the context and the situation of the speaker in that socio-cultural context. We have varieties which are distinct from one another. So, when you are talking in a religious gathering, the same person may use the person of the same speaker of the same variety may use serious and full of static expressions in a religious discussion. If you are giving a seminar or I am talking to you in this class, I will tend to be highly formal, analytical and argumentative. So, I have this academic register, though I am speaking English. So, language is not different, dialect, the variety I am speaking is not different. The only thing is that the context is different and that bears upon changes and variations in style, and this variation is called, this variant is called register. Language is not different, by the way, it remains the same language, but a different register. So, we need to understand the difference between dialect and register, language and register. And while the same person talking to friends and family, you become very casual and informal. So, the degree of formality associated, right, the context and the domain in which you are using the language will determine the variety. So, domain specific variety, occupation specific varieties are called registers. Then we have another term called style. Style is purely, uh, you know, style is purely related to the degree of formality. the scene, the settings in which we use the language. So when we speak very formally, you know, so the degree of formality is very high. When you are casual, the degree of formality is low. And our choices are governed by circumstances and our communication partners, the audience who participates in your exchange and communication. So, for example, if you are in a ceremonial occasion, you are on stage making announcements or presiding over a function, the tone and tenor of the speech will be highly formal, right? Public lectures, less formal. Casual conversation, quite informal. And conversation between inmates, highly informal and casual. And there are several factors which contribute to level of formality, and it depends on on a variety of factors, like for example the kind of occasion you are speaking in, various social, age, and other differences that exist between the participants. The way you speak to the kids and the way you speak to your seniors and the elderly people, the style will be different. The particular task that is involved. So in writing, you use a different variety of the same code. However, in speaking, we tend to be more casual and more informal. So you'll have characters like degeneracy, incompleteness, idiosyncrasies. They recur in our oral varieties. However, in written varieties, we are very formal, and we try to complete the sentences, right? So the particular task what is involved also determines the kind of language, the kind of variety you are going to use. Your style is determined by the format of the use of language. Then the emotional involvement of one or more participants. If you are emotionally charged, the style of speaking will be different. So there are multiple factors which determine the style of a speech. So now we have terms like language, we have terms like dialects, we have terms like registers, we have terms like style. So they all denote certain variation in the use of language. But what we are talking about, social linguistic variation, and we're talking about language and variation in general. We are not referring to these variations, but we are referring to the socio-linguistic factors which trigger variation in language use, which are consistent in nature, which are high frequency, which have a pattern and which are consistent. And there is no conscious effort to suppress these variations, but instead there is an urge and a trigger to assert these variations. If you look at dialectology, which studied linguistic variations, the aim of the dialectology study to study linguistic variation was to understand and explain the dialectal variation based on the geographical location of the language. So it was purely linguistic variation, where we talked about variation in accent, we talked about variation in style, we talked about variation in speech, we talked about variation in syntactic structure, sentences, we talked about variations in language, selection of words at lexical levels. They're purely linguistic variations. But post 1960s and post William Lebov's experiment and study in Martha Vineyard Island and fourth floor survey or social stratification of language English in New York City, that established a correlation between such variations and so linguistic variations, or you can call it linguistic structures and social structures. And Lebov becomes pioneer in introducing such kind of linguistic analysis and understanding of a correlation between language structures and social structures. So, we are talking about that variation. And Lebov himself talks about socio-linguistic variables, and he says that it's important to understand and identify a socio-linguistic variable, and then you can establish a correlation. So, Lebov specifies the ideal social linguistic variable to be high in frequency irrespective of the context and situation. It is prolific, it has a pattern of occurrence, and it is high in frequency. For example, the sound ra in his New York study, or for example, raised vowel in his Martha Vineyard Island study. And such studies have been replicated in numerous languages by a number of scholars, establishing linguistic correlates and social structures. Uh, the second point he makes is it has a certain immunity from conscious suppression. What does it mean? That speakers deliberately chose it to express themselves, and such expressions have certain socio-cultural antecedent. So they are not random, they are predictable. Uh, it is part of an integral part of a larger structure. In the discourse, it frequently occurs, and such variables are easily identifiable, quantifiable on a linear scale. So, if you are able to understand and identify these variables, social linguistic variables, or these language changes, they are predictable, they have patterns. And what happens in Martha Vineyard Island? If you look at that study, the islanders tried to create a separate independent identity and express their solidarity with the community by raising the vowel vocalic sound. So it was a deliberate thing with a different socio-political motive. So it was not purely a language variation, but its correlates in socio-cultural, ideological, political space, right? So we all vary in terms of in terms of accent, in terms of style, in terms of different registers, but we need to understand uh, the variation in terms of the social determinants and factors, like do the factors like age, the factors like gender, the factors like class, the factors like geographical location, the factor like socio-cultural space, the factors like issues of identity and solidarity, do they make a difference the way we use the language? Do they factor basically in our use of language? And if they do, that's what we need to understand and identify, right? How come gender be a factor in two varieties of language or language use for that matter? A lot of studies have been done so far afterwards, like Robin Legoff study, Devra Tannen for that matter, right? And so many other people have studied, right? So gender becomes a factor in understanding different use of language by men and women, and there are lots of theoretical framework and debates about it. Class becomes a factor in language use, right? So the idea of language variation actually entails a number of theoretical issues, right? And you can understand the sociolect for that matter, or the regional dialects for that matter, right? Specifically, sociolect becomes a very important topic for discussion and understanding when we look at a class that determines social class as a factor which determines variation in language use. So we'll talk about uh, all these factors and issues and themes in our subsequent videos when we talk about founding fathers of modern social linguistics. We'll talk about William Lebov, his journey as a linguist, his 1963 studies of Martha Vineyard Island, his 1964 study of English in New York City. Similarly, we'll talk about ideas like diglossia. We'll talk about sociology of language by Joshua Fishman. We'll talk about Basil Bernstein's idea about class and codes. So, in separate lectures and videos, we'll talk about all these themes and major thrust areas and the whole variationist tradition pioneered by Lebov, and you can see around you as well. Look at your mother tongue or look at the language you speak and look at the changes, variations that you noticed when the same language is used by different people. Try to understand what are the factors. First and foremost, to identify the differences. Differences may be at the level of accent, pronunciation. Differences may be at the level of choice of words, right? Differences, religion becomes a factor. If you look at Kashmiri for that matter, Kashmiri as a language, and it's reported in the study that there is a conscious choice of words by a particular religious community to use, for example, shirin and khand. Khand means sugar. So one community uses, religious community or the followers of a particular religion, they use khand for that matter, and the other community uses, let's say, shirin for that matter, for sugar, or for ab versus jal, the water, tres in Kashmiri, and you can find so many examples all around you where a particular set of speakers prefer a particular set of words, right, to be used, and that is a conscious choice. You might find a particular set of class, social class, that uses the language in a particular style. However, the other class uses the same language with a different style, right? So it's all up to you to see around you, but this is what the story of language variation. We'll continue our discussion in other classes about the details of these variations and how gender, how age, how class, socio-political preferences, spaces, identity issues, and solidarity in the group factor in the difference in language use. And with this, we close this discussion for now. We'll continue with these topics in our further videos. Thank you very much for now.